It's my pleasure to welcome back Geoff Cohen to FAN. As mentioned, we hosted Geoff for a Zoom in 2022 when Belonging was released. He was in conversation with Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. That event, by the way, that recording is on our YouTube channel. You can go check it out if you're curious later. We're honored and grateful that he accepted this invitation for an in-person event. He is a professor of psychology and the James G. March Professor of Organizational Studies and Education and Business at Stanford. The book Belonging, The Science of Creating Connection and Bridging Divides was released in 2022, and now the paperback is out. It's about the causes and consequences of a sense of belonging in school, work, politics, healthcare, other arenas of social life. His research examines processes that shape people's sense of belonging in self and implications for social problems. He studies the big and small threats to belonging and self-integrity that people encounter and strategies to include more inclusive spaces for people from all walks of life. He believes that the development of psychological theory is facilitated not only by descriptive and observational research, but by theory-driven interventions. LeViis Haney, our new friend too, is the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at Stevenson. He also teaches principal preparation courses as an adjunct at Northeastern Illinois University and Loyola University Chicago, and he's a facilitator for the Kaleidoscope Group, which is a DEI firm based in Chicago. He has extensive experience in designing schools for equity throughout his career, with the implementation of personalized instructional models with an emphasis on culturally responsive instruction and restorative practices. Two great people on stage. Let's welcome Geoff Cohen and LeViis Haney.
Thank you all for being here this evening. I am absolutely thrilled to be in conversation with you. We have read your book. We have analyzed your book. We have implemented the strategies embedded throughout the book. And so we want to talk about it.
That's great.
So
it's my dissertation defense a little bit. Oh, thank you.
So we're going to kick things off with the first question. And that question is, please tell us about yourself. What got you interested in the topic of belonging? Are there any personal experiences that inspired you to get into this topic and write this book?
I would say there's two things. One was my kind of personal and professional experience working in social psychology. I worked under a fantastic mentor named Claude Steele, who was doing research on diversity and how stereotypes shapes people's sense of belonging and their performance in school. And that relationship really shifted me and affected me and really made me understand and appreciate this idea that belonging isn't just a product of success. It's actually a precondition for it. And a lot of the work in social psychology that I knew of and that I've been studying for a long time, it all seems to converge, so much of it on just the importance of that sense of safety, you could call it, but feeling accepted for who you are and how important that is for a wide range of effects, wide range of adaptive outcomes from performance to health, to achievement, to motivation, to mental well-being. So that was part of it, the sort of professional world, and I really am proud to be a social psychologist, and I feel like at this stage in my career, that's my role is to kind of get it out there in the world, because I really, really do believe this science is so useful, but so underutilized. And then the second is, I think one I probably share with a lot of people, this sense of kind of being an outsider. I think we all feel like an outsider sometime. I know I grew up as a pretty shy, introverted kid in New Jersey, and I never quite, so I was trying to figure out, how do I fit in? How do I get into the in crowd? Is it something about what you wear or how you talk? And I think that feeling of being on the outside, trying to get in, I think it's something that, ironically, we all share. Our kind of sense of being different is what unites us. And so I think it was that my own experience, autobiographical experience, that made that research resonate and made me want to write this book. And I think in the world we live in today, belonging is kind of front and center. That is the goal of a truly pluralistic democracy, I think, is to create a fair and equitable system where all people feel and really do belong. It is such an urgent mission we have now. So the timeliness of it as well.
I definitely agree. It's certainly an urgent issue. And I want to ask you now about belonging itself. Like, what exactly is belonging, right? Like, are you referring to belonging as a noun or a verb? Is it a thing? Or is it a process?
Yeah, because my first aspiration was to be a grammarian. So it's very interesting. It's like, it's a gerund, right? It's both, right? It's both. It's a state. It's a state. And it's always situated. You always belong to something, usually a group or a school or a community. So it's that sense of mattering to a group and the group mattering to you. It's kind of a two-way street. And it's at its best, right, when you really feel truly embraced for who you are. Now, that's kind of an ideal that we often don't get to in our institutions, in our communities. It's a long-range project in our lives to find a place where we truly do feel at home. And that's why it's also a verb, too. It's a kind of ongoing process. We're trying to kind of figure it out, find our home, grow roots. Bell Hooks, who also wrote a book about belonging, she has this metaphor of belonging kind of being rootedness to a place. So when you feel rooted, you feel like you're not going to sort of fly away. And the little adversities that come at you, feel like you can withstand them when you have that kind of ground beneath your feet. And I feel like belonging is that state, but it's also kind of ongoing process that we're all trying to create, all trying to find, all in search for throughout our lives. The message of the book, and I think the research, is that we can be really proactive in it, and we each have a kind of role to play in helping one another belong, even in the smallest corners of our social lives. So I think it's both, this kind of ongoing flux, and it's a state. It's a state. And I would say it's almost like a side note, like a kind of via negativa. You really appreciate when it's kind of pulled out from under your feet. That's why I love these studies by Kip Williams, where he just, long story short, he has people playing like a video game online where they're playing catch with these avatars. They don't even know who they are. They're actually just pre-programmed computer entities. And all of a sudden, the two avatars stop throwing the ball to you. And he's like, what is the effect of that relative to a control group? And as he puts it, the effect of that is pain. You put people in the scanner, research by Matt Lieberman and Naomi Eisenberg suggests you put people in the scanner. And actually, the regions in their brain associated with registering physical pain are activated. Belonging hurts, and we really feel it. There's moments when we feel excluded. A lot of us, the more privileged, more advantaged in certain situations, we don't really appreciate it until it's pulled out from under us. And so I think, in some ways, belonging is both a state and a verb, but it's also something that you really appreciate when you think about the opposite, what it feels like to be excluded. And even momentary exclusion can be painful. And then you talk about prolonged exclusion, and the research suggests that's one of the most toxic things out there.
That makes so much sense, Jeff. I want to ask you a question that we actually were discussing last week. We talked about what does it mean to belong, and if that means we have to conform to a larger group, or does that mean something different?
Yeah. Does it mean you have to fit in? That's a really good question. I think, someone told me this, we will do, especially when we're young, anything to belong. Anything to belong. And so it is something that we're kind of trying to achieve, and that often we achieve through conformity. For example, there's a study where they momentarily ostracize people by playing that kind of game of catch I talked about, and they find that people who go through that experience are more likely then to conform to strangers in another task who are offering a totally erroneous opinion. So often we kind of go with the group or conform with the group in order to achieve belonging. But I kind of think that that's sort of a faux belonging, where you're kind of having to kind of conform and not be fully yourself in order to kind of gain that sense of inclusion. It's not the true kind of inclusion that you get when you feel accepted for who you are. And I think institutions and communities can do a lot to accommodate difference and diversity. They can kind of create openings in situations and in the institutions for people to be who they are, express who they are, and contribute. So I think that true belonging comes from that sense of really being valued and mattering and not having to kind of conform to fit in.
I mean, as a follow-up to that, because that feels right? Like to be able to be your authentic self. But I think about all of the different situations where we have to maybe tuck a part of us away or to perform in a certain way. And so is that like a bad thing? Like, should we look to not conform, or are there things that we can do to better position ourselves to be ourselves, if that makes sense?
Well, I think so. I think so. In those kinds of situations, it's very helpful, research suggests, to recall or reflect on what's most important to you, your own values. Right. So it's possible when we're in those situations where we feel like we might be excluded, or we feel like we are excluded, to kind of summon belonging from elsewhere. So in one study, for instance, people who completed an activity where they just wrote about their most important values, like what really matters to you? What do you stand for? What might you even die for? Those people were less susceptible to the kinds of effects that I was talking about before. They were less likely to kind of conform in order to fit in. So that kind of rootedness, you can kind of achieve it on your own a little bit. You can kind of grow it on your own. But it takes practices. They're kind of like practices that you can kind of call on in these challenging situations to reroot yourself when you're feeling like I don't belong or I might be excluded. Visit and revisit your values, because they're very easy to forget. So I would say that in answer to that really great question.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of situations, one thing about your book that's super helpful is that it is packed with strategies, right? It's given us so many different avenues to practice activities to create belonging. And often these solutions involve something you call situation crafting.
Yeah.
So tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah.
What is situation crafting? And share some examples that might be helpful for us in a high school context.
Yeah, this is like one of my most exciting things. But I remember when I was taking my first year psychology course, I read about the Milgram study, where people are kind of goaded into doing something terrible, actually harming an innocent person, thinking that they actually kill them. It's total ruse because of social pressure. Mm-hmm. And I was like, gosh, man, this explains so much, from war to terrible acts of inhumanity to the toxicity of the high school cafeteria, so much. And social psychology, kind of, the Milgram study being an exemplary example, is all about one thing, and that is the power of the situation. We, in this kind of Western world we live in, we think that really what matters is what's inside of us: character, ability, values, virtues. We really think that kind of what's inside of us, dispositions, are the drivers of behavior. But it turns out what matters much more than we think is the context, the situation, right here, right now. Little things like making eye contact, paying attention, listening, practicing gratitude, saying I really appreciate you. These things really matter a lot. One study that illustrates this is an awesome study by Lee Ross and colleagues, or to make a long story short, they bring people in to play one of these strategic economic games where you can kind of act in your own self-interest and try to grab the pot of money for yourself, or you could kind of cooperate with your adversary and maybe share an even larger pot. So do you do defect or cooperate? Now, what people think is that the people who are kind of selfish SOBs, they're the ones who are going to defect, and the people who are really nice, kind people or have the reputation of it, they're the ones who are going to cooperate. That's what people think is going to matter. But actually, what really matters isn't so much their disposition, but rather the name of the game that the experimenter gives it. If you come in and the experimenter says, hey, you're going to play the Wall Street game. This is called the Wall Street game. Same exact objective game, it's just framed differently. 70% of people defect. But the same game, if you say this is a community game, 70% of people cooperate. I love that study. So inspirational. It suggests we can kind of all, in our lives, kind of turn little situations into kind of community games through the words we choose. I know it's not easy. It's not easy. And that's why the science comes in, because it shows, like, how do you do this stuff? How do you kind of create that magic? And sometimes you can't. But sometimes, I think in a lot of cases, we have a lot more room to maneuver and to create change than we think. And so the power of the situation, which kind of cede some power to the individual. That means the individual. I think it's like the opposite of a great truth is also true. Situation is powerful, so is the individual as individuals, we are all part of every situation we're in. And that means we can affect it, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot, by changing the context. Now, there's all these little ways we can do it, but let me give you one example of situation crafting. This was a line of studies with David Jaeger, Lee Ross, Claude Steele, and we were just looking at this dilemma that's common in social life. How do you give good constructive criticism, especially across lines of difference? And so here we were looking at the racial divide between teachers and students. A white teacher gives critical feedback to a black student in school. Well, how do you do that? There might be this sort of misperception on the part of the recipient, the student, that, well, maybe this criticism that I'm getting means I don't belong, or the teacher thinks I don't belong, or they think I can't cut it. And that might be especially true for students of color who are often facing, as Claude Steele shows, negative stereotypes about whether they belong or not. And a lot of research showed that when black students were getting critical feedback from across the racial divide relative to white students, they were more likely to kind of see it as biased than their white peers. There was sort of what's called an attribution on ambiguity. This situation is a little unclear to me. I don't know if I can take the criticism at face value or not, or if this is some sign of bias. For one group of students, though, we had the teacher pen this note. It was like a little bit of situation crafting. We changed the situation just a little bit. The teacher wrote before the 2 pages of criticism that they gave to students in this experiment, I'm giving you this feedback because I have high standards and I believe in your ability to reach them. So the teacher was expressing a faith in the person's potential. And these were 7th grade students of color. Getting that message for people who feel on the outside can be water on parched soil. I know I felt that too in many places in my life, where just that little word of encouragement at the right moment can make all the difference. And for people who are facing negative stereotypes or who may be marginalized, a little act like that can really be deeply meaningful. So what we found is that for those students who received just the critical feedback from their teacher, the percentage of students who revised their essay, who sort of dusted off their boots and tried again, that was 17%. But for those students who got the same feedback with that little note, I believe in your ability to reach a higher standard, the percentage was 71%.
Wow.
And then not only that, when we looked years and years later, we found that those students who had received the note, 60% of them made it to college based off of official records, relative to, in the control group, 40%. You start to wonder, I am just kind of blown away by a lot of these data, because it's like it suggests that there's opportunities all around us to make these differences. And a lot of them go missed, like in the control group, where it's the evidence that the people are missing opportunities to steer and create new trajectories. But if you have a little bit of awareness of the power of the situation, the power you wield to recreate or recraft the situation, you can make a little bit of difference, and sometimes a big one. And I actually want to be really clear here about this idea of situation crafting. I'm not saying that a note is going to solve all our problems, right? Or the achievement gap, for instance. It is that in the right time and the right place for the right person, a little bit of encouragement can make all the difference. And we all kind of wield this power in our lives with the people that we care for, that we take care of, that we're trying to support. Thinking, appreciating these moments where we can tweak the situation just a little bit to make things conducive to their success. I've been moved by this as not just a scientist, but as a mentor and a parent myself. I really have found this idea so useful. It's almost like a superpower to reforge the situation. And oftentimes you can't do a lot, but sometimes we can all make the situation just a little bit better. Just a little bit better.
Wow. I think we all know the power of like those individual comments, but like to hear like that the research behind it is both inspiring and kind of scary.
Kind of scary.
So, yeah.
And kind of scary about the status quo, right? Like,
right.
It suggests that a lot of kids aren't making it to college who should.
Absolutely.
In normal circumstances.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I want to ask you about a core piece in your book. It's a fundamental concept in social psychology for those of us who don't remember it from our intro to psych class, please explain what is the fundamental attribution error and how it shapes our interactions with others so powerfully.
I just, that concept is so important. The fundamental attribution error. It was coined by Lee Ross, who passed away a couple of years ago, but he was just a wonderful, brilliant social psychologist. The term, it refers to a bias that we have, especially in the Western world, to attribute behavior, as I was saying earlier, to personal disposition, what's inside of people, and to neglect or forget or not inquire about their situation. So it kind of goes backwards too, right? Situation can really influence behavior, but then oftentimes when we see behavior from other people, especially when we see behavior that seems different or objectionable, we're very quick to blame the person rather than the situation. And that's a fundamental attribution error. We blame the person too much and the situation too little. It's like a blind spot that we have. It's like a blind spot that we have. And a lot of times we just don't think to ask about it. One example I have from a friend of a story of a person who, a student who, she came into class having seen a racial slur written in the bathroom. And then in the classroom, she was kind of not able to pay attention and was kind of distracted, and the teacher kind of called her out on it. From the teacher's perspective, she's thinking, or he's thinking, that this student just isn't motivated here. But there's a backstage that helps to understand the experience of the classroom from her point of view. And I think, I don't know about you, but I feel like in my life, I encountered this so many times. Someone disappoints or lets us down or, does something objectionable. And then years later, sometimes you find out, oh, they were going through something difficult. I had no idea. So the fundamental attribution error, one of the top things I think we can do is fight it in our lives. Fight this urge to blame people rather than context and really understand the power of context. One example of this is some awesome research by Jason Okanafua over at Brown University, where, long story short, as I see it, he helped teachers of high school students to overcome this reflex, this cognitive reflex of the fundamental attribution error. And he did, two things. One is he reconnected with the teacher's values. So he affirmed the teachers, like what we talked about. Why did you get into this? What does this field all about? What is your higher calling? And almost all the teachers agree, I got into this to make a difference. So reminders of affirmations of higher principles. That was the first thing. But then once they were kind of affirmed in this way, he helped them to understand that a lot of the behavior that we see in your classroom disruptions or dynamics, they're often due to context, not so much disposition. And it's often the subjective context, like what the classroom is like from behind the eyes for the student. Like sometimes a lot of students just don't feel like they belong. They feel like an outsider in the classroom for various reasons. And just remember that. And that could be what's kind of causing them to, for instance, misbehave. The how is just as important as the what in these interventions. So he didn't just simply tell teachers this, like kind of give them a little speech or a lecture. He put them through active reflection activities where they could draw these conclusions themselves. And that's what a lot of these situation crafting interventions do, is they create the conditions for people to draw new conclusions on their own and open up to novel perspectives. And so what he did was to ask the teachers, like, think back on your own lives. Have you ever can you remember any situation in your life when you were maybe a student where you felt like you didn't belong? How did it make you feel? So there was like a kind of emotion-based empathy. And then he asked them, and then he also asked them, how did you get over it? Did any teacher help you? And all the teachers could think of a very powerful story. One teacher wrote about a professor who really kind of expressed a belief in her potential, much like the wise criticism I just talked about, and how that just made them feel included, seen. Anyway, what that intervention did, it's just 2 hours. It's a kind of teacher, I don't like the word training, but it's sort of teacher education module given to teachers. It cut the suspension rate throughout the school district in half. And this was just replicated at a kind of national scale. And all of it is about changing our mental prism so that we're less quick to pass judgment. I think judgment kind of is one of the kind of big sources of mischief here. Change your prism. I often tell my students, your prism is almost like a prison, right? It can kind of really limit you and others but kind of changing it to open up to new perspectives, to have that kind of faith and belief in people and not rush to judgment, that can really liberate you and liberate other people. So that's the fundamental attribution error, tendency to blame people more than context, and we can work through emotional empathy, through our own reflections, through retraining our minds to overcome it. And I think that would go a long way, to help youth, to help all of us to kind of find a bit more, roots, a sense of community. Because judgment is pretty toxic.
Certainly is. Thanks, Jeff. So belonging is important, right? Right. But at the same time, you say that the drive to belong can sometimes lead to ridiculous and even dangerous beliefs and behaviors. Is it the way we belong that's the problem?
Yeah. I think it's true. We all need some port in the shore, you could say. I can't just be sailing endlessly at this ocean. I need some harbor. And what happens now, some politicians are aware of this, is when people feel unrooted and don't have that place where they have a sense of belonging in the larger country, for example, they're very susceptible, very vulnerable to organizations and extremist movements that offer that sort of secure base, that sense that I belong here, right? Politics, for one. I think lonely people, for instance, are much more likely to get into politics because they're on that kind of quest for belonging. There's a story of C.P. Ellis, who was interviewed by Studs Terkel many years ago. But long story short, he became a KK wizard, grand wizard, and then later renounced his KKK membership after befriending a black social activist, Ann Atwater. And he describes his journey, C.P. Ellis, and he says this, which is, I didn't join the Ku Klux Klan because I believed in anything they said. I just felt like they saw me and they cared about me. And he describes that moment when he was like kneeling before the altar. This little guy, he felt like someone. Yes. And that's kind of where I think a lot of bad behavior comes from. It's not from bad disposition, not bad character. I mean, sometimes it is, right? I think we over-exaggerate that in the fundamental attribution error, but I think it often comes from these really human motivations to fit in, find a place, belong, and if people don't have that, it can lead you down some very dangerous paths. And I know, I feel like we've all been there. I know I'm not at my best when I feel ostracized or excluded or insecure, right? That is such a hard, and we're kind of vulnerable. We're a bit vulnerable at those moments, and we often rush to judgment, and we'll kind of embrace ideas that we might not otherwise. Years ago, I did a little study where we just found that, for instance, when you tell Democrats and Republicans that, oh, your group supports this policy, they supported the policy too, even if the policy totally violated their ideological principles. That's how strong this need to belong is and where it can take us. But if it's satisfied, like for instance, as we affirm our values, if I feel seen in my school or my community, I feel like my country recognizes me and cares about me. It's not just for the rich and the wealthy and the educated, it's for all of us. Then I think that shields us from some of these nefarious influences. And I really do believe that, I know belonging isn't the answer for everything, for sure. It's just a piece of the puzzle, but a really, really important piece. But I do feel like the problems with every generation change, and now they're really, really pretty great, greater than they've been in my lifetime. But I think the solution's often the same. It's kind of, you get through it together, and by kind of creating communities of common purpose. And if you don't do that, oftentimes you just make the situation worse.
You're right. Belonging isn't everything, but I've worked in communities where gang issues were present, and I believe that just like you described the KKK and people who become members, like it was the same for the gangs. Like gang leaders knew that that people that didn't feel connected, like they could provide that.
Yeah.
And they can provide that belonging.
They can provide that belonging. Yeah, I think that's how they do it in a lot of cases. They exploit the need to belong for bad ends in a lot of cases. But it also suggests that, if you kind of we know this from the literature on youth, especially at-risk youth. What makes all the difference? Beyond just the kind of material resources, of course that's important, but finding a mentor or a role model who sees you and believes in you. Even just one relationship, sometimes even just one powerful encounter can make a huge difference in the lives of high-risk youth and prevent them from going down that path. I know as parents too, you can kind of do that. One of the big predictors, this was a huge national study where they were looking at the predictors of youth violence, youth mental illness, youth reckless behavior. This was teenagers. And they put in like one of these battle royale regressions where you put everything into the algorithm and see what predicts. And it's like kids' GPA, whether they're living in a single household, whether there's guns in the house. The biggest predictor was better outcomes was students' sense of connection or belonging at school and in their homes. If they had that, their risk level was much lower for violence, reckless behavior, even suicidality. So you think about that. It's a kind of psychological resource that we provide. I think too often we're thinking about the material resources we can provide. Opportunity. Of course those are important, but we forget these kind of invisible things that are so important and so precious for so many people. And people are so, there's so many people who don't get enough of it. And that can really lead to some bad outcomes.
Which is probably why schools create mentor programs, right?
Yeah.
Shameless.
One of the best things you can do.
Shameless plug.
No, it's one of the best things you can do. Good mentoring programs.
I want to go back to this concept of fundamental attribution error and talk about the power of stereotyping and how the two go hand in hand. You had the good fortune of working with Claude Steele early in your career, and who is best known for his conceptualization of stereotype threat and his research demonstrating its effect on cognitive performance. Can you tell us about Steele's notion of stereotype threat and how it relates to belonging?
Yeah. Stereotype threat is the apprehension of being seen through the lens of a stereotype. That's it. And we all know what this is like, right? We're all kind of members of groups that in different situations might be negatively stereotyped. And when we feel it, when we think we're being seen in a negative way through the lens of a stereotype, it can kind of divide your attention. So now I'm not just thinking about engaging with the situation, I'm thinking about this kind of latent issue of am I being seen negatively? Am I being seen as dumb? Am I being seen as one of them? And my attention is just divided. And there's a lot of stress that goes along with that. I've worked with people where I was sure, I had a mentor like this where I was sure he just thought I was really, really stupid. And I could almost kind of feel the judgment in the air. And when I met with him, it was almost as if I could feel the IQ points just kind of seeping out of my head. Like, well, I couldn't say anything. And to this day. But then, if he just kind of gave me a little nod or a smile, I said, oh, that's a mediocre idea at least, and I felt a little better. So stereotype threat is that, but it's felt consistently for individuals who are in an institution, let's say school, where they're consistently stereotyped, as many groups are. For instance, many members of underrepresented groups, such as Latin Americans, Black Americans, are negatively stereotyped, or there are negative stereotypes about their groups in school. And in situations like school, there may be in their awareness that possibility, which is very realistic and adaptive, that I could be seen negatively here through the lens of the stereotype. And that's stereotype threat. That's stereotype threat. And it's totally adaptive. It totally makes sense. Like if you know the stereotype is out there, it makes a lot of sense to be wondering whether or not it's in play here. It's in play. Oh, thank you. Thanks. And if you've experienced bias or discrimination in school, then it kind of puts people on alert. All organisms kind of have this sort of threat response where you're kind of learning the dangers in your environment and then trying to predict them. And so if you've been burned or betrayed by stereotypes, you're kind of on alert for them to be used against you again. Anyway, so stereotype threat, what it does is, one perspective is it changes the subjective landscape your experience of school, for instance, in this case. Now it's a bit more threatening, at least a little more uncomfortable than it might be for someone who's white or not stereotyped, or for a woman in STEM versus a man. There's this kind of extra layer to the situations that I have to contend with. And it's easy to forget, but the situation is different. And I would say that's kind of one of the key take-home lessons of social psychology, beyond the power of the situation. Situation matters, but it's not just the objective situation, it's the situation behind the eyes and how it's being seen. And for individuals who are contending with a history of stereotyping or who simply know the stereotype is in play, the situation can feel very different. And then little things can kind of activate the stereotype, like saying, "You're really smart," when the teacher uses ability praise. That can suddenly activate the stereotype. Like, oh, this is a place where what is really valued is ability. Or things like giving a standardized test can activate the stereotype because of those tests' association with racial bias. The same test feels very different from the perspective of someone who's stereotype threatened. And the research suggests that for very difficult tasks, for very difficult tests, stereotype threat can undermine, even impair people's performance. And this was Claude Steele's famous studies showing that standardized test performance of African-American college students cut in half. Women in math cut in half when they think they're taking a test under stereotype threatening conditions. Like, this is a test that's diagnostic of your ability. But then say the same test has nothing to do with your ability at all, the stereotype is irrelevant, the two groups perform equally. That's the power of stereotype threat. It's a kind of thing in the air, as Claude puts it, thing in the air that can make the situation more uncomfortable, feel like one where I'm an outsider, more perilous.
And Jeff, as a strategy, wouldn't you say that those affirming notes, wouldn't that help in that regard?
That's why I think in a lot of these interventions, what you're doing is kind of disabusing people of the possibility that the stereotype's in play. And a little bit can go a long way. Like the note, I believe in your ability to reach a higher standard. It deflects the stereotypes. One of the best interventions for academically at-risk, low-income students, it's been found, turns out to be exactly the opposite of what this culture does, which is to put them in gifted and talented programs or honors programs. And what you do with that is you say, I believe in you. It's a gesture, a very credible gesture of my belief in you and my renunciation of the stereotype. And research suggests that's one of the most powerful things at raising students' performance, at-risk students' performance, helping them to feel like they belong, helping them to get into college. Sarah Cahotes and Yuri Treisman did some classic research. That's honors, I believe in you. And a lot of times the schools and the interventions often do the opposite. They kind of put kids in a remedial track, which turns out to do oftentimes more harm than good because it reinforces the stereotype. So, and of course it's not like I'm just going to put you in the honors class and not give you the support you need to reach those higher standards. There's often a lot of group work and intensive adult supervision to kind of help scaffold the students to meet the standards.
Yes. So now you're talking systems, right? How do you achieve belonging when a whole system has been created to discriminate and exclude people?
Yeah.
How do you reconcile what you do as a social psychologist and the need for systemic reform?
Yeah. It's such a great question. My answer is academics don't say this enough. I don't know. I really don't know. But let me give a few thoughts. One, structural reform is paramount. That's goal number one. And we're in this era of cultural reckoning. Top of the list, diversity. Diversify our institutions, our leadership, our politics as much as possible. Because one of the things that tells people that they belong is the reality that people like me are here. So programs that accomplish that, systemic reforms, are really paramount, top of the list. You have to be proactive about it. You also have to be wise about it. It turns out that a lot of our efforts at these kinds of structural reforms, like for instance to reduce bias in hiring, to increase diversity, a lot of them don't really work too well. For instance, there's just telling people, be less biased, be more fair. That actually doesn't work. And in some research, it backfires. People think, oh, yeah, the fair thing to do is to hire the guy rather than the woman, right? In my mind. But instead, and instead what you can do is to create systems or kind of do a little situation crafting to bind the mind against stereotyping. So one example that I love is from Jack DeVideo, where he's looking at reducing discrimination in the promotion of soldiers in the military. And all he does is this. Tells the Human Resource Office, all we want you to do is just keep track of any racial imbalances in promotion. So there's like monitoring. And then, by the way, if there are any, just explain why. So it's like accountability plus you're kind of being aware, and you're kind of getting outside your skull to like look at yourself from the point of view of other people. What that did is to eliminate the racial gap in promotion rates in the military for the time it was implemented. So it's not enough when we kind of have these structural reforms to simply have the intention. We need to be really smart about it. There's also some lovely research by Jessie Smith where she kind of creates small proactive groups equipped with psychological and social strategies for diversifying, like ads and how you word them, where you look, the list, where you go to kind of find more talented people to recruit in STEM fields. And I'll just do a call out for her work. She finds that this completely eliminated the gender disparity in hiring rates among faculty in STEM at the university that she applied this. In fact, I think now there's, at this university, there's slightly more female faculty in STEM as a result of these efforts. So structural reform is paramount, but there's also things we can do, ways we can kind of craft our policies and our decision-making systems to be more equitable. Good intention isn't enough. We have to be wise about it. So I would say that, and then I would also say that a lot of these wise interventions shine a light on the injustices of the system. So that note study that I mentioned, you can ask the question, well, why in the world, in the control condition, weren't the kids getting that kind of message of high standards already? Right? What is going on there? And then you start to think about the influence of stereotypes and low expectations that kind of permeate our culture, these little biases that turn out to have big consequences, like thinking that the real key to success is being a genius or innate talent. Turns out that when teachers say that kind of things, research by Mary Murphy, Andre Simpian, and others suggests it actually reinforces gender disparities and racial disparities because it kind of raises the prospect of the stereotype and it suggests that, if I'm not in, I must lack some talent. So twofold, structural reform requires situation crafting, and another is that these little tweaks of the situation really shine a light on the injustices of the system, and then you really just start thinking about the lost opportunities under the status quo. So structural reform is paramount, and then also in addition, in spite of all the systemic problems that we're facing, down on the ground, every single day, we can make a little bit of a difference through these sorts of wise interventions. Because in the end, every moment, you got to kind of deal with the cards you've been dealt. And so what a lot of these strategies are about are dealing with the situations as they are delivered with you and in the best way possible, the art of social life.
Yeah. Jeff, how does unconscious bias contribute to the crisis of belonging?
Oh, yeah. A lot. I think a lot. I think we could use a lot more humility about our own minds. That's for one. We tend to have what's called an objectivity illusion. We think that we see the world as it is, which is really problematic. And it turns out that feeling like you're objective is one of the biggest predictors of whether you'll be biased. Because people aren't monitoring. We do these little studies, this was with Eric Ullman, where it was a simulation hiring a police chief, either a male candidate or a female candidate. And what we found is that the big predictor of gender bias or discrimination, gender discrimination in hiring the male candidate over the female was self-perceived objectivity. Those who thought they were being objective discriminated the most against the female candidate. But their minds played tricks on them. Because they thought they were so objective, they just weren't monitoring for this. So one of the ways this happens is through what we call constructed criteria, which is when people kind of rearrange or reset the criteria for the job to fit the qualifications of the candidate that they want to hire. So we found that when it was a male police chief who had people skills, the the evaluator said, you know what's really important to be a police chief is people skills. And even if the male applicant had a kid, then the evaluator's like, yeah, even having kids, I could see how that kind of relates to this job. Versus street smarts, if you didn't have much street smarts, then they said, that's not so important for the job, not as important. So people kind of rearranged their criteria to fit the qualifications of the man. And then what happened? And then they hired the man, and they kind of had this feeling. I think it's like this: like they felt like they hired the right man for the job, when in fact they picked the right criteria for the man. And again, people who had this objectivity illusion were more likely to do that. Now, the way you beat it isn't just by saying be unbiased, be fair. You get smart about it. For example, in this study, we did a little intervention that has turned out to kind of be propagated pretty in a lot of different places throughout the country, which is just to have people pre-commit to criteria. Before you even open the folders, let's decide what's really important to the job and stick to it. And we found that eliminated gender discrimination in this paradigm. I think that, I think of Richard Feynman, the physicist. He was talking about science, but I think this applies to social life, right? He's like, the first principle is don't fool yourself. And you are the easiest person to fool. He's talking about science. I think that applies to social life too. So I think humility and really being introspective about the possibility that you could do something that you don't want to do. I mean, it's almost like we're all drivers on the highways of social life, and sometimes we might just be distracted, right, and stressed or not paying attention, a kind of distracted driver, and we could cause an accident. So being aware of our everyone, and I can include myself in this, of our potential to do damage, even when we don't want, in spite of good intentions, because of these implicit biases and sometimes explicit biases, I think that's a key step. And then if we're aware that we could be biased or act in a biased or unfair way, then we could take steps to implement practices to prevent it.
We live in a world right now in which we still tend to stay in situations with people who are like us, a sort of tribalism we typically experience. How do we shine a light on that problem?
Yeah. Well, I think it is a problem. We know that. For example, in our politics, we know that I think it's roughly 1 in 10 of our interactions is with people from the opposite political side in a given day. And in some vicinities, like the coast and the Midwest, is even smaller than that. We are highly segregated on partisan lines, racial lines too. And we know from social psychology that one of the big predictors of antipathy and mistrust is simply separation. And one of the best solutions is integration, or even just kind of creating opportunities for contact, especially cooperative contact. Even just creating opportunities for conversations across lines of difference. I think that makes so much of a difference, the research suggests. But there's an art to it. Having these conversations, you can't just go in thinking my job here is to persuade you. Here I'm thinking of some awesome research by Dave Brookman and Josh Collett on what's called deep canvassing. And what they do is they create these conversations, I'm going to sort of simplify it, between canvassers and very conservative voters in Florida. And they talk about these controversial issues it's not just Florida, but controversial issues ranging from transgender rights to immigration. And they're just 10-minute conversations, but they find that they're transformative for the residents, for the voters. For instance, in one study, conservative voters became much more supportive of transgender rights, not only immediately, but 6 months later. And that's a big deal, because most of the research suggests that prejudice reduction interventions, most of them don't last. But here you have a 10-minute conversation that had these large and long-term effects. What did these deep canvassers do? In a word, listen. It just had a conversation. Turns out that one of the worst things you can do is just kind of throw information at an adversary, argue with them. It almost kind of feels coercive. Instead, they talked about the issue, they listened, because listening is a really good way to convey belonging. I'm hearing you, I'm seeing you. And then, in addition, they created a little mental challenge. And there's lots of components to the intervention, but this was one key one, where the canvasser would ask almost like a kind of cone or Socratic question that got the voter thinking. And it was this, in one of the studies: the transgender study, the canvasser asked the voter, you know what? We all know that it hurts to be excluded sometimes. Can you think of a time when you've been excluded for something about you that you can't change? This kind of emotion-based empathy. So a little challenge. And then a lot of people opened up. It kind of created an opening in the conversation. For instance, one soldier, one voter who was a soldier, recalled how he had PTSD as a result of fighting in Iraq, and he couldn't find a job because of his PTSD. And then he kind of began like, yeah, I could see how my experience connects with that of a transgender individual not feeling fully seen. That kind of emotion empathy was really, really key. So it's both listening, asking good questions, listening to the answers, and creating this kind of bridge of understanding in our conversations. And you can do that through these kinds of tactics, like creating emotional empathy. I would do a call out for one little strategy that we've developed. This is Michael Schwabe, a postdoc student. He found that one of the best things you can do in having these conversations across lines of difference, first is just to have them, to try them. But number two is when you give your opinion, precede it by two words, I think. And he found that it had two effects. One was that the other person felt more like they were respected because this is just the other person expressing their point of view. But actually, and also in addition, the speaker became a bit more subjective and a bit more humble about their own opinions. Like by saying I think a little bit more, we start to realize, yeah, what's floating through my mind and my beliefs are points of view. Points of view. And I shouldn't necessarily believe everything I think. And these practices, kind of behaving in certain ways, kind of makes us, changes us in ways that might be more constructive and productive.
So we have another strategy, I think. We got to write that down. So we have about 2 minutes left for our final question. How might organizations like ours mobilize ourselves to incorporate these ideas into our culture?
I would give three answers. One is what's referred to as perspective getting, asking good questions, listening to the answers. We don't do this enough. Research by Nick Epley suggests that we are way overconfident in our ability to read other people and think we know what they need. And so we don't think to ask them, hey, what do you need? And we could do more of that. Ask students, what is it, how is this place for you? Does you feel like it's at home? What could be done to make it better? We don't do enough of that. I know it seems obvious, but we don't do enough of it because of these biases, the kind of overconfidence heuristic. One great study, I'll just do a call out. This is by two economists. Awesome study where they just asked first-generation students at a university, what do you need to succeed in college? And they said two things, more faculty engagement and more tips about how to do better. Based on that, they implemented an intervention in introductory courses where the instructor just sent a couple of emails providing that kind of engagement. Here are my office hours, and here's a few tips to get better. Usually with an intervention in education, an effect size of about 0.2 standard deviations, pretty good. In this study, the effect size was 1.0 standard deviations, a full grade point, one of the biggest effect sizes I've ever seen. That's the power of perspective getting. Number two is mentoring programs. As we discussed, turns out mentoring is great, both for peer mentoring, both for the student doing the mentoring and the person receiving it. Buju Dasgupta, among others, has done some great research where she finds just 5 sessions of mentoring between female science majors, STEM majors, and incoming first-year students who are planning to major in science. Just 5 hours of mentoring throughout that first year increases the percentage, I think by roughly 14%, the percentage of women who make it through the 4 years and stay in STEM. So mentoring is really good, but it's not just mentor. There's instructions and guidance on how to do it. She has the mentors do what Greg Walton and I do with our social belonging intervention, where the mentors share stories about, it's difficult for me. It was hard my first year. And what that does, but here's what I did to kind of fit in. And what that does is kind of normalize these sort of feelings of uncertainty about belonging that a lot of us have when we're transitioning into a new program or a new institution. So it wasn't just, it was kind of wise mentoring. And there's a lot of research, so I would just look at, her research is amazing. So it's well-structured mentoring where there's sharing of vulnerabilities and adversities so that students feel like, yeah, I'm not the only one. And because that feeling of being the only one who's experiencing difficulty can be really toxic. Okay, so mentoring, perspective getting, and then the last one is empowerment. Empower people. Empower people. One of the, I was giving a talk at Worcester, and what they did was really interesting. I didn't even think of this. They took the ideas and created a class for students where they talked about belonging, the science of belonging. And then they empowered the students to kind of find out more about what's going on your campus, and how can we make it better. So the students were put in positions of empowerment to make the change that they wanted at their institution. And there's this amazing study by Betsy Pollack where she basically applied that idea to reduce disciplinary problems in middle schools throughout New Jersey, and she just created these little, you could call them breakfast clubs, of diverse individuals working together, diverse kids working together to talk about their issues and how to make the school better throughout the year, and then kind of implementing some of the things, like putting up, giving hashtags for acts of kindness, putting up a behavioral repertoire for how people can reduce drama at their school. They did all these things, and what that did was to cut the disciplinary problems at schools by roughly a third. So I would say those three things are kind of top of my list. Mentoring is so powerful. Perspective getting, and don't try to change people, change their situations, and empower them to change, to make the life they want. That's all.
What a wonderful conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
We appreciate you.